Karen Mitchell had always been the type of person who spoke her mind. At 43, she worked as a customer service manager at a department store in downtown London. Her friends knew her as someone who never backed down from what she believed was right, even when it got her into trouble. This particular Tuesday morning in July started like any other day, but it would end with Karen making headlines across the world. The summer heat was unbearable as Karen walked through the crowded streets near Buckingham Palace. She had taken the day off work to visit her elderly aunt who lived nearby. The tourist crowds were thicker than usual, with people from all over the world gathering to catch a glimpse of the famous royal guards. Karen found herself pushed and shoved by the masses of people, all trying to get the perfect photo. As she made her way through the crowd, Karen noticed something that made her blood boil. A group of teenage tourists were harassing one of the Queen's guards, making jokes and trying to make him break character. They were taking selfies right in his face, completely ignoring the ropes that marked the boundary visitors weren't supposed to cross. The guard stood perfectly still as trained, but Karen could see the tension in his posture. What happened next would change everything. One of the teenagers, a boy who couldn't have been more than 16, started making crude jokes about the guard's uniform. He called the traditional bearskin hat ridiculous and began mimicking the guard's stance while his friends laughed and recorded videos. The crowd around them seemed to find it entertaining, but Karen felt her anger rising. The guard, a young man probably in his early 20s, maintained his professional composure despite the humiliation. His rifle was held at his side in the traditional position, and his eyes stared straight ahead as he had been trained to do. Karen watched as sweat dripped down his face in the hot sun while these tourists treated him like a statue instead of a human being serving his country. Karen had seen enough. She pushed her way through the crowd, her protective instincts kicking in. The teenager was now pretending to march alongside the guard, copying his movements in an exaggerated way that drew even more laughter from the growing audience. Someone in the crowd shouted encouragement to the boy, telling him to get closer for a better video. The breaking point came when the teenager reached out and pretended to adjust the guard's hat. He didn't actually touch it, but he came close, enough that Karen could see the guard's jaw clench slightly. The crowd cheered, thinking it was hilarious. Karen felt her heart pounding with rage at the complete disrespect being shown to someone who couldn't defend himself. Without thinking about the consequences, Karen stepped forward. She had no plan, no thought of what might happen next. All she knew was that this young soldier deserved better than to be treated like a tourist attraction. The crowd was so focused on the teenager's antics that nobody noticed Karen approaching from the other side. In that moment, Karen made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She reached out and grabbed the guard's rifle, intending to somehow help him or make the tourists back off. The second her fingers touched the cold metal, she realized the terrible mistake she had made. The guard's eyes widened in shock, and the laughter from the crowd suddenly stopped. The moment Karen's hand touched the rifle, time seemed to freeze. The guard's training immediately kicked in, and he tightened his grip on the weapon while his eyes locked onto Karen's face. The teenage troublemaker who had been causing all the problems suddenly stepped back, his phone still recording but his cocky smile completely gone. The crowd that had been laughing just seconds before fell into stunned silence. Karen felt the weight of her mistake crash down on her like a ton of bricks. She had acted on pure emotion, wanting to protect the guard from harassment, but now she realized how her actions must look. Here she was, a middle-aged woman grabbing a loaded military weapon from a member of the Queen's Guard. Her good intentions meant nothing in this moment of pure terror. The guard, whose name tag read Jameson, was now in the most difficult situation of his military career. His training told him that anyone attempting to take his weapon was a serious threat, but his common sense told him that this frazzled-looking woman probably wasn't a terrorist. Still, he couldn't take any chances. His grip on the rifle became firmer, and Karen could feel him trying to pull it away from her. "Let go of the weapon immediately," Guard Jameson said in a stern voice that carried across the silent crowd. These were the first words Karen had heard him speak, and they sent a chill down her spine. She wanted to let go, but her hands seemed frozen in place from shock and fear. She tried to speak, to explain that she had only wanted to help, but no words came out. The teenage tourists who had started this whole mess were now backing away quickly, suddenly realizing they might be in serious trouble too. Their phones were still recording, but their faces showed panic instead of amusement. One of them whispered to his friends that they should leave before the police arrived, but they seemed too scared to move. Other tourists in the crowd began pulling out their phones to record what was happening. Within minutes, dozens of people were filming Karen's humiliating mistake. She could hear whispers and gasps from the crowd as more people gathered to see what was going on. Someone shouted that the police were coming, which made Karen's panic even worse. Karen finally found her voice, but it came out as a shaky whisper. "I'm sorry, I was just trying to help," she managed to say, but Guard Jameson's expression didn't change. His duty was clear, and he couldn't let anyone compromise. His weapon, no matter what their intentions might have been, he began speaking into his radio, calling for immediate backup. The crowd was growing larger by the minute. Tourism police who had been stationed nearby came running when they heard the commotion. Karen could see them pushing through the crowd, their faces serious and focused. She knew that in just a few moments her life was going to change forever. What had started as an attempt to defend someone was now going to land her in more trouble than she had ever imagined. As the seconds ticked by, Karen became more aware of just how serious this situation was. She was holding a military weapon in one of the most secure areas of London, surrounded by witnesses and cameras. There was no way to explain this away or pretend it hadn't happened. Even if she let go right now, the damage was already done. The guard's radio crackled with responses from his commanding officers. Karen caught words like security breach and immediate response required. Her heart was racing so fast, she thought she might faint. She looked around at all the faces staring at her with mixtures of shock, fear, and curiosity. These people would remember this moment for the rest of their lives, and so would she. The tourism police reached Karen within 30 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Officer Davies, a tall man with graying hair who had worked this beat for 15 years, immediately took control of the situation. He had seen his share of tourist incidents, but never anything quite like this. His voice was calm but firm as he addressed Karen directly. "Ma'am, I need you to slowly release the weapon and step back with your hands visible," Officer Davies commanded. Karen's hands were trembling so badly she wasn't sure she could follow the instruction properly. She loosened her grip on the rifle, but her muscles seemed locked in place from fear and adrenaline. Guard Jameson maintained his professional stance throughout the ordeal, but Karen could see beads of sweat forming on his forehead. He had been trained for many scenarios, but having a civilian grab his weapon in broad daylight with hundreds of witnesses was not something covered extensively in his training manual. His eyes remained focused and alert, scanning the crowd for any other potential threats. More security personnel arrived on the scene, creating a tight circle around Karen and the guard. The crowd was being pushed back to create a larger safety zone, but people were still recording everything on their phones. Karen realized with growing horror that this incident would probably be all over social media within minutes. Her face, her mistake, and her moment of complete humiliation would be shared thousands of times. "I wasn't trying to hurt anyone," Karen finally managed to say, her voice barely audible above the murmur of the crowd. "Those kids were harassing him, and I just wanted to help." Officer Davies nodded, indicating he had heard her, but his expression remained serious. He understood that Karen's intentions might have been good, but the reality of the situation was much more complicated. The teenage troublemakers who had started the harassment were nowhere to be seen now. They had slipped away during the commotion, leaving Karen to face the consequences alone. She felt a wave of bitter irony wash over her. The people she had tried to defend the guard against were now safely gone, while she was about to be arrested for trying to help. A police van arrived, followed by what appeared to be military personnel. Karen's heart sank as she realized just how seriously the authorities were taking this incident. She had grabbed a weapon from a member of the Queen's Guard, and that was considered a major security breach regardless of her motivations. The fact that she was a harmless middle-aged woman didn't matter in the eyes of the law. Officer Davies approached Karen slowly, his hands visible and his voice steady. "Ma'am, I understand you were trying to help, but I need you to completely let go of the rifle now. Once you do that, we can sort this whole thing out properly." Karen nodded and forced her fingers to release their grip. The rifle returned fully to guard Jameson's control, and she immediately raised her hands as instructed. The moment Karen let go of the weapon, she was quickly but gently restrained by 2 officers. They were professional and not rough with her, but the handcuffs felt cold and heavy on her wrists. She had never been arrested before, never even had a serious traffic ticket, and the reality of what was happening felt like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. As Karen was led away from the scene, she caught a glimpse of Guard Jameson's face. For just a moment, his professional mask slipped and she could see what looked like sympathy in his eyes. He knew she had been trying to help him, even though her method had been completely wrong. That brief moment of understanding was the only comfort Karen would have for a very long time. The crowd slowly began to disperse as the excitement died down, but many people lingered to discuss what they had just witnessed. Karen could hear fragments of conversation as she was escorted to the police van. Some people were sympathetic, saying she had meant well, while others called her stupid and reckless. All she wanted was to disappear and pretend this had never happened. The police station was nothing like what Karen had seen in movies. The holding area was sterile and cold, with bright fluorescent lights that made everything look harsh and unwelcoming. She sat on a narrow bench, still wearing the handcuffs, trying to process what had happened to her life in the span of just 20 minutes. Her one phone call had gone to her sister Margaret, who had screamed in disbelief before promising to find a lawyer. Detective Inspector Sarah Coleman entered the interrogation room carrying a thick file and a cup of tea. She was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes but a no-nonsense attitude. She had been assigned to Karen's case specifically because of her experience with unusual incidents involving tourists and locals. She sat across from Karen and studied her for a moment before speaking. "Mrs. Mitchell, I've reviewed the witness statements and watched several videos of the incident," Detective Coleman began, her tone neutral but not unkind. "I understand you were trying to help, but I need you to walk me through exactly what you were thinking when you grabbed that rifle." Karen took a shaky breath and tried to organize her thoughts, knowing that her words could determine her future. Karen explained about the teenagers, their harassment of the guard, and how frustrated she had become watching someone who couldn't defend himself being humiliated. She described the crowd's encouragement of the bad behavior and how helpless the young soldier had looked. Detective Coleman listened carefully, occasionally asking for clarification, but mostly just letting Karen tell her story. "I know it was stupid," Karen admitted, tears starting to form in her eyes. "The moment I touched that rifle, I knew I had made a terrible mistake. But I couldn't just stand there and watch them treat him like he wasn't even human. He's someone's son, you know? He's serving his country, and they were making fun of him for entertainment." Detective Coleman made notes as Karen spoke, her expression thoughtful. She had dealt with many cases involving people who claimed good intentions, but something about Karen's story rang true. The woman sitting across from her didn't seem like a troublemaker or someone seeking attention. She seemed like someone who had let her emotions override her common sense in a moment of frustration. Meanwhile, back at Buckingham Palace, Guard Jameson was being debriefed by his commanding officers. The incident had been reported all the way up the chain of command, and everyone wanted to understand exactly what had happened. Jameson explained that he believed the woman had been trying to help him, though her method was completely inappropriate and potentially dangerous. The videos from the incident were being analyzed by security experts. They could clearly see the teenagers harassing the guard and the crowd's encouragement of their behavior. They could also see Karen's approach and the moment she grabbed the rifle. What came through in the footage was that she hadn't tried to point the weapon at anyone or use it threateningly. Her body language suggested confusion and panic rather than malicious intent. Back at the police station, Detective Coleman was wrestling with a difficult decision. Technically, Karen had committed a serious crime by interfering with a military weapon. The law was clear on this point, and there were dozens of witnesses and video evidence. However, the detective had to consider the circumstances and Karen's obvious remorse and good intentions. "Mrs. Mitchell," Detective Coleman said after a long pause, "what you did was extremely serious. Grabbing a weapon from a member of the Queen's Guard is considered a major security breach. Even with good intentions, you could have caused a dangerous situation or gotten someone hurt. Karen nodded, understanding the gravity of her actions more clearly now than she had in the heat of the moment. The detective continued. However, I can see from the evidence that you weren't trying to cause harm. The question now is what happens next. This case is going to attract a lot of attention, and the decision about charges isn't entirely up to me. The Crown Prosecution Service will have to review everything and decide how to proceed. Karen felt a chill run down her spine. She realized that her life might never be the same, regardless of what the final outcome might be. The videos were already spreading online, and she could only imagine what people were saying about her. Her job, her reputation, and her future all hung in the balance because of one moment of poor judgment, driven by good intentions. Karen was released on bail 12 hours later, but stepping out of the police station felt like walking into a different world. News vans lined the street, and reporters rushed toward her the moment she appeared. Camera flashes blinded her as journalists shouted questions about her motives and whether she regretted her actions. Her sister Margaret grabbed her arm and hurried her toward a waiting taxi, both women keeping their heads down. The ride home was silent except for the radio, which was already reporting on the incident. The news anchor described it as an unusual security breach at Buckingham Palace, and mentioned that a local woman had been arrested for interfering with a Queen's Guard. Karen felt sick knowing that everyone she knew would soon hear about this, if they hadn't already. At home, Karen's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Reporters wanted interviews, friends wanted explanations, and strangers had somehow gotten her number to either support or criticize her actions. She finally turned the phone off and sat in her living room, staring at the television as news channels showed the footage over and over again. Seeing herself grab the rifle made her cringe every time. The story had gone viral on social media within hours. Karen and the Guard was trending, with thousands of people sharing opinions about what she had done. Some called her a hero for standing up to the teenage bullies, while others labeled her a dangerous fool who could have gotten someone killed. The comments ranged from supportive to absolutely brutal, and Karen made the mistake of reading too many of them. Her employer called the next morning. The department store's management was concerned about the negative publicity and felt they had no choice but to place Karen on unpaid leave pending the outcome of her case. 20 years of dedicated service meant nothing when faced with viral videos and potential criminal charges. Karen understood their position, but it still felt like another blow to her already shattered world. The teenage tourists who had started the harassment were eventually identified through social media posts, but they had already left the country. Their parents issued statements through lawyers expressing regret for their children's behavior, but they faced no real consequences for their actions. Karen found this deeply unfair, knowing that her attempt to defend the Guard had resulted in far more serious repercussions than the original harassment. Guard Jameson, meanwhile, was dealing with his own challenges. Military protocol required him to complete detailed reports about the incident, and he was temporarily reassigned to duties away from public areas while the investigation continued. He had expressed to his superiors that he believed Karen's actions, while wrong, had been motivated by a desire to help him rather than cause harm. A week after the incident, an unexpected development changed everything. A video emerged from a different angle, shot by a tourist who had been recording before the teenagers started their harassment. This footage clearly showed the extent of the bullying behavior and Karen's obvious distress as she watched it unfold. It also captured audio of the crude comments the teenagers had made about the Guard. The new video painted a more complete picture of the situation. Viewers could see that Karen had endured several minutes of watching the harassment before she finally snapped. They could hear her telling the teenagers to stop before she took her drastic action. The footage showed her genuine concern for the Guard's dignity and her increasing frustration with the crowd's encouragement of bad behavior. Public opinion began to shift as the fuller story emerged. Many people started to see Karen not as a dangerous troublemaker, but as someone who had made a poor decision while trying to do the right thing. Support groups formed on social media, and a legal defense fund was established by strangers who believed she had been treated unfairly by the system. The Crown Prosecution Service faced pressure from multiple directions. Legal experts pointed out that Karen's actions, while technically criminal, were clearly not motivated by malicious intent. The new video evidence supported her claims about trying to help, and character witnesses described her as a law-abiding citizen who had never been in trouble before. The case was becoming more complicated than anyone had initially expected. Karen watched these developments with mixed emotions. She was grateful for the support, but uncomfortable with the attention. All she had wanted was to help a young soldier, being humiliated by tourists, and now her life had become a public debate about good intentions, poor judgment, and the consequences of viral moments in the digital age. 3 months after the incident, Karen stood outside the courthouse wearing her best dress and trying to calm her nerves. The Crown Prosecution Service had decided to proceed with charges, but they had been reduced to a lesser offense due to the circumstances and public pressure. Her lawyer, a sharp woman named Helen Brooks, had negotiated for the lightest possible sentence given the evidence and Karen's clean record. Inside the courtroom, Karen was surprised to see Guard Jameson in civilian clothes, sitting in the gallery. He had requested permission to attend the sentencing, and his presence there meant more to Karen than he could possibly know. When their eyes met briefly, he gave her a small nod that seemed to convey understanding and forgiveness for the chaos her good intentions had caused. Judge Patricia Henley had reviewed all the evidence carefully, including the videos, witness statements, and character references submitted on Karen's behalf. She was known for fair but firm decisions, and everyone in the courtroom waited tensely for her to speak. Karen's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears as the judge began to address the court. "Mrs. Mitchell," Judge Henley began, her voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom, "what you did was undoubtedly wrong and could have had serious consequences. Interfering with a military weapon is a grave matter, regardless of motivation." Karen felt her stomach drop, but the judge continued. "However, the court has considered your previous good character, your obvious remorse, and the circumstances that led to your actions." The judge acknowledged the harassment that Guard Jameson had endured and Karen's frustration at witnessing it. She noted that while Karen's response was completely inappropriate, her motivation appeared to be protective rather than malicious. The new video evidence had been crucial in understanding the full context of what had happened that day at Buckingham Palace. Karen received a suspended sentence and community service, along with a requirement to complete anger management courses. The judge emphasized that this was not a trivial matter, but that prison time would not serve justice in this particular case. Karen felt weak with relief as the gavel came down, knowing that her worst fears about lengthy imprisonment had not come to pass. Outside the courthouse, reporters again swarmed around Karen, but this time the questions were different. They wanted to know how she felt about the outcome and whether she had any regrets. Karen kept her statement simple. She was grateful for the court's understanding, deeply sorry for her actions, and hoped that people could learn from her mistake about letting emotions override good judgment. Guard Jameson approached Karen as she was leaving the courthouse area. He introduced himself properly for the first time, and they spoke briefly away from the cameras. He thanked her for trying to help him that day, even though her method had been wrong. He told her that the incident had led to better procedures for protecting guards from harassment, which was at least one positive outcome from the whole ordeal. Karen returned to her job at the department store. Though it took months for things to feel normal again, customers occasionally recognized her, and she had to endure whispered comments and stares. Some people treated her like a celebrity, while others clearly disapproved of her actions. She learned to live with the attention and focused on rebuilding her reputation through consistent good work. The incident changed Karen in unexpected ways. She became more thoughtful about her actions and more aware of how quickly situations can spiral out of control. She completed her community service at a veterans support center, which felt appropriate given the circumstances of her case. The work there helped her understand better the pressures and challenges faced by military personnel. A year later, Karen received an unexpected letter from Guard Jameson, who had been promoted and transferred to a different assignment. He wrote to thank her again for caring about his dignity. even though her way of showing it had caused problems for both of them. He mentioned that the improved harassment policies had made a real difference for guards on duty, and he wanted her to know that some good had come from that terrible day. Karen kept the letter in her desk drawer at home, a reminder of how good intentions can go wrong, but also of how people can find understanding and forgiveness even in the most difficult circumstances. She never fully regretted trying to help, but she had learned valuable lessons about finding better ways to stand up for what's right without making situations worse for everyone involved.